Hello, I'm Joseph Dillard. Defense mechanisms are important for integral deep listening because they constitute a fundamental barrier to waking up. Their identification and description is perhaps the most important and substantiated aspect of Sigmund Freud's considerable contributions to understanding human development and the workings of the human mind. Interestingly, they are the product of Freud's investigation of dreams and were first laid out in his monumental work in 1900, The Interpretation of Dreams. Defense mechanisms are baked into human cognition, like cognitive biases. They are built in emotional reactions that usually do not involve thinking. The thoughts that we have when we are using a psychological defense are rationalizations, meaning that they can just barely be considered to be either thoughts or conscious, because they are not only emotionally driven, but are designed to justify prepersonal emotions, beliefs, worldviews, and most of all, to protect our sense of self by reducing cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance occurs when information threatens our sense of self. Because it is a threat to who we think we are, that information has to be reduced or eliminated in some way. Defense mechanisms can be viewed as a fundamental way we go about reducing cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is viewed by integral deep listening as a wake-up call to be respected, personified, and listened to. When we feel a need to reduce cognitive dissonance, that's a sign that our identity really is too narrow and requires revision. But instead of doing so, we protect it, doubling down and walling ourselves off from wake-up calls and reality. By making defense mechanisms conscious and learning to be on the lookout for them, we reduce the likelihood that we will use them to continue to sleepwalk our way through our life, purposely ignorant of and cut off from our emerging potentials and life compass. In the following, I will describe 10 of the most common and powerful defense mechanisms, why we use them and misuse them, how they cut us off from our emerging potentials, and how IDL recommends that they might best be addressed. Denial is the refusal to accept reality or facts. It occurs when we block what's happening or what we hear so that we don't have to deal with its emotional impact and can avoid painful, uncomfortable threats to our status quo identity, relationship to others, work, or the meaning of our lives. Denial shows up in integral deep listening interviewing when we do what we can to avoid looking at or thinking about what an interviewed character has said or recommended. Perhaps we don't read over interviews we've done, because to do so reminds us of possibilities that disturb the comfort of our current sleepwalking. Perhaps we don't do interviewing at all or allow others to interview us, which functionally amounts to denial, even while we may profess the utility of interviewing in IDL. The way to deal with denial is to create a support system that reminds you of why you are doing your integral life practice and which also provides some degree of accountability to keep you on track. That's what school systems provide, and so we need to duplicate some of those elements in our lives to counteract the natural influence of denial and other defense mechanisms. Repression occurs when we don't write down the dreams we do remember. Scary and irrational dream experiences are threatening to our sense of safety and control. That which is repressed is like the undead or Dracula in his crypt. It's hard to keep a good vampire down. Those things which we keep stuffed into the basement of our consciousness keep resurrecting like zombies from outtakes of the Night of the Living Dead. Movies and stories of resurrecting and haunting monsters and demons capture our imagination because they depict the reality of the mechanism of repression, something that all of us intuit on a gut, primal, physiological level. Repression puts our need for both control and safety higher in our priorities than respect and openness. Repression therefore provides an excellent example of why defense mechanisms exist in the first place. Who wants to feel unsafe? Who wants to feel out of control? The way that IDEAL addresses these fears is to become perspectives that do not themselves experience a lack of safety, because they have no bodies, have not been born, and so cannot die, and that do not fear a loss of control because they have no stable identity to protect, while you and I do. By experiencing such identities again and again over time, we gradually become comfortable feeling secure without needing security, and without feeling in control, without needing to be in control or exercise control. Clearly, perspectives that don't feel a need to be driven by security or control needs, or by a desire to preserve a certain identity, are transpersonal. It takes time and repetition to grow into them, and that is a primary purpose of character identification in IDEAL interviewing. The next defense mechanism is called projection, and it occurs when we attribute to others motives that we ourselves possess but disown. For example, when we view a dream villain or monster as threatening, who is threatening us? Isn't the monster persecutor itself a projection of our own fears? To the extent that we are co-creators of our dream experience, Freud's conclusion that projection is at work in dreams appears conclusive. If I fear rejection, I may conclude you are rejecting me. Interviewed emerging potentials don't fear rejection. Therefore, when you develop relationships with them, you are surrounding yourself with a support system that doesn't do projection. This is rare and valuable because almost all human relationships are built on all sorts of assumptions we project onto each other. The next defense mechanism is called displacement, and it occurs when we succeed in safely persecuting others. We can also demonstrate displacement toward ourselves, as we do when we indulge in self-criticism or devalue dream and imaginal elements as irrelevant or irrational, as a means of reassuring ourselves that we are in control. A classical example of displacement is the boss who chews out his employee, who goes home and yells at his wife. She turns around and scolds her child, who kicks the dog, which attacks the cat. What's going on? With displacement, we get the satisfaction of emotionally reacting and venting unacceptable feelings in abusive ways towards some object or person that isn't a threat. We get to feel vindicated and in control. The empire does this when it sanctions and attacks countries that are no military threat to it. If this reminds you of the persecutor role in the drama triangle or games persecutors play, as described in our video describing our scripting, you're getting the idea. The next defense mechanism, regression, is a fun one. We get to stay in control by identifying with an earlier, less accountable, blameless, and authentic stage of our development. Regression is basically avoidance. Clearly, avoidance has fundamental adaptive value. It is smarter to avoid a conflict than it is to fight. Generally, fighting is the better solution only when avoidance doesn't work. Regression is escapism into the comfort of our familial and social cultural scripting. We regress every time we return to the comfort of our favorite addictions: surfing the internet, social media, reading or watching drama and fiction, alcohol, sex, drugs, and my personal favorite, chocolate. This is a good example of how much regression is harmless and provides a useful timeout for recharging our batteries. However, it is good to remember that drops of rain wear down mountains, and that behaviors that are innocent enough by themselves can collectively do a lot to keep you sleepwalking through life. Regression is probably most obvious in the face of threat or trauma: panic attacks, phobias, post-traumatic stress disorder, societal crisis. In such situations, it is obvious that regression is a flight to the relative safety of our most primitive patterns of feeling, thinking, and behavior. The next defense mechanism is called rationalization, and it's perhaps my favorite because it summarizes all defense mechanisms as ways to justify our protection of our sense of self and the rightness of maintaining our security and control. In this sense, all defense mechanisms can be viewed as psychological, pre-verbal rationalizations. However, rationalization is more commonly understood as explanations we give ourselves to justify whatever we are feeling, thinking, or doing. We generate stories to provide our own set of facts in order to explain why we are late, lose our temper, lie, cheat, steal, murder, or go to war. We get to feel comfortable about the choices we made. For example, there are no guilty people in prisons. Everyone has an explanation that excuses or explains away their actions and absolves them of responsibility. In ideal, we might use rationalization to explain to ourselves why we are not acting on any of the recommendations of interviewed emerging potentials. The next defense mechanism, sublimation, involves the channeling of destructive or socially unacceptable impulses and desires into channels that are positive or earn social validation. Glasser wrote a book some decades ago called Positive Addiction, in which he explains this process of substitution. Examples are exercise, yoga, music, art, sports, meditation, vegetarianism, philanthropy, volunteering, and the donation of time and resources to others who have no means of compensation. Cognitive behavioral therapy uses substitution to deal with cognitive distortions in order to reduce depression and anxiety. The recommendations of interviewed dream characters and the personifications of life issues can be viewed as substitutions that sublimate the sleepwalking associated with most life issues and many dreams. The next defense mechanism, reaction formation, occurs when we recognize how we feel but choose to act in a way that is opposite of our impulses or reactivity. Someone pisses us off, and so we treat them with an especially friendly way. Anger is not permitted as an emotion, and so we overcompensate by demonstrating what a selfless, thoughtful, and generous person we are. Rescuers need to be on the lookout for reaction formation. They would do well to ask themselves, is my helpful behavior an expression of my desire to compensate for my fears that I am really insecure, selfish, and out of control? IDL takes an interesting approach to reaction formation. It treats sources of insecurity, selfishness, and discontrol with respect and listens to them, thereby diffusing them as potential motivators for rescuing or defense. The next defense mechanism is called compartmentalization, and it involves separating life into independent sectors so that behaviors and worldviews in one sector do not challenge or conflict with the assumptions, worldviews, and behaviors we have in another. This can be therapeutic. It's when we leave home dramas at work. It's when we leave home dramas at home and use work to refocus in productive ways. However, it can also be highly dysfunctional as when we disconnect waking and dream states or imagine there is no psychological price to pay for being exploitative at work and loving at home. Society generally rewards and encourages compartmentalization. In addition, it exists because it allows us not only to maintain our identity, but to focus and deal with the realities of our present environment. Therefore, compartmentalization is a good example of why discounting defense mechanisms as bad or dysfunctional is not a winning strategy. We have good reasons for why we use our defense mechanisms, and we aren't going to give them up just because we try to intellectually shame ourselves out of them. Intellectualization is also one of my favorite defense mechanisms. Anything can be ignored or discounted as an intellectualization. In fact, traditional psychoanalysts are notorious for using intellectualization to maintain a top dog authoritative position in the relationship with their clients. Anything a client says can be minimized or discounted as a defense mechanism in order to maintain control in the relationship. How can we effectively deny that we are not in denial? Such a charge is perhaps an intellectualization, and to the extent that it is, it serves the purpose of defending the therapist from a fear of loss of control. Intellectualization defends against uncomfortable emotions by employing objectivity as a weapon. If I am feeling threatened with a loss of control, I can distance myself from my fear or confusion and instead focus on quantitative facts. I can sound authoritative and reassure myself that I am in control of the situation. Intellectualization is a particularly sneaky defense mechanism because objectification is a major mechanism of self-development and is generally desirable. Therefore, intellectualization often passes under the radar and is accepted as legitimate when it isn't. For proof of this, consider media, political pronouncements, and the explanations most of us give for what we do and don't do. These often surpass mere rationalization and rise to the level of sophisticated cognitive mindfuck. Beware of using defense mechanisms as a club to beat others up with, which is something people often do when they first discover them. They see these defense mechanisms all around them and everyone. If you catch yourself identifying everyone as employing defense mechanisms, ask, why am I labeling someone as in denial, or regressing, or projecting? You may be correct, but you may also be putting yourself into the role of persecutor in the drama triangle, posing as rescuer while convinced you are a helper, outside the drama triangle. Defense mechanisms can be viewed as a type of self-deception. You are fooling yourself to maintain your sense of security, control, and basic sense of who you are. Because you are fooling yourself, you have no one to blame but yourself, and no one to rescue you but yourself by waking up out of your self-delusion. Defense mechanisms are powerful and effective. That's why we use them. Recognizing defense mechanisms is even more powerful and effective, and therefore we have to remember that, like all powerful tools, they can easily be misused. Interviewing the personifications of your life issues and dream characters gets around this dilemma by directly addressing emotions that otherwise may twist themselves into defenses. Such interviewing demonstrates trust and confidence that letting go of your need for security and control, of your very sense of self, won't kill you, but instead is a path to freedom. To get a handle on your defense mechanisms, you need an accountability structure. That's how we made it through school. we were held accountable. We need an accountability structure because we are so subjectively enmeshed in our defenses that we can easily deceive ourselves regarding our mastery of them. Ideal interviewing is itself a powerful component of your accountability structure. That's why Ideal encourages you to treat it as a yoga, to take it as seriously as you would a sacred discipline, your education, or your life work. Create and require accountability structures for yourself. If you don't, you're probably fooling yourself. You probably aren't serious. You want to pretend or imagine that you are addressing your stuckness when you may remain 90% pretense and 10% authenticity. Monitor your application in some sort of concrete way, like reviewing a chart before bed. Report on your progress, or lack of it, to trusted others. Use self-interviews, interviewing others, and having others interview you as a form of cybernetic feedback to help you see your blind spots, what you are missing, and how to improve your yoga, integral life practice, and application. Thanks for watching. See you next time.